Emma Thompson slumped into her economy seat on Flight 237, exhaustion etched across her face. The past week spent caring for her ailing mother had drained her completely. She tucked her designer handbag under the seat, pulled her curly hair into a loose bun, and settled in for the 3-hour journey back to London. Despite her weariness, Emma's mind quickly shifted to work mode. As the newly appointed Vice President of Customer Experience at Skyway Airlines, she believed in experiencing their service exactly as regular passengers did. No special treatment, no first-class upgrades. Around her, passengers bustled about, storing luggage and finding seats. The cabin hummed with conversation and the occasional cry of a restless child. Emma pulled out her tablet, planning to review customer feedback reports before landing. Her throat felt parched after rushing to catch the flight. When flight attendant Robert Wilson passed by, Emma raised her hand slightly. "Excuse me, could I please have some water?" Robert barely glanced her way, his eyes skimming over her casual attire, worn jeans and a simple navy jumper. "You'll have to wait until the beverage service," he muttered dismissively before turning away. Emma blinked, taken aback by his curt response. She watched as Robert immediately approached the well-dressed businessman seated beside her. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I get you anything before takeoff? Perhaps a glass of water or our complimentary newspaper?" The contrast was striking. The businessman, older with silver-streaked hair and an expensive suit, received a warm smile and attentive service. Emma, despite making the same request moments earlier, had been brushed aside. She felt that familiar knot tightening in her stomach, a sensation she knew all too well. Throughout her 15-year career in the airline industry, such subtle discrimination had followed her like a shadow. As one of the few black women in senior management, Emma had worked twice as hard to reach her position, facing countless microaggressions along the way. 3 rows ahead, Robert laughed heartily with another passenger, a blonde woman in business attire. He promptly fetched her a blanket when she mentioned feeling cold. Emma took a deep breath. She could easily pull rank now, flash her executive ID, demand appropriate service, and watch Robert's face fall when he realized his mistake. Many would say he deserved such embarrassment, yet Emma knew better tactics existed. True leadership wasn't about wielding power, but creating meaningful change. Instead, she discreetly pulled out her notebook and began documenting her observations. Time, specific behaviors, differences in treatment, all noted with the precision that had earned her reputation as a meticulous executive. These weren't just incidents to fuel a reprimand. They were valuable data points for the comprehensive customer experience overhaul she planned to implement. An elderly gentleman across the aisle noticed Robert's behavior and caught Emma's eye with a sympathetic glance. He seemed about to say something when the plane began taxiing toward the runway. Emma smiled back reassuringly. This wasn't her first encounter with prejudice, and she doubted it would be her last. But her position now offered something she hadn't always had: the authority to create systemic change rather than merely cope with its effects. As the aircraft rose through the clouds, Emma reflected on her journey. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Birmingham, she'd heard countless times that the airline industry's executive ranks weren't places for people like her. Each promotion had brought new challenges, each achievement questioned or attributed to diversity initiatives rather than her exceptional skill. When the seatbelt sign switched off, Robert began the beverage service, still seemingly unaware of Emma's significance to the company. He started from the front, deliberately taking his time with passengers he deemed important. Emma continued her notes, adding specific ideas for training improvements. This wasn't about punishing one flight attendant. It was about identifying patterns that needed correction throughout the company. Sometimes the greatest power came not from immediate reactions, but from patience and strategic thinking, a lesson that had served Emma well throughout her career. While waiting, she pulled up the company's current customer service manual on her tablet, already highlighting sections for revision. By the time Robert finally reached her row with the beverage cart, nearly 45 minutes into the flight, Emma had outlined the framework for what would become Skyway's most transformative training program. An hour into the flight, Emma's throat felt parched again. The small plastic cup of water Robert had reluctantly provided earlier was long empty. She pressed her call button, watching as the light above her seat illuminated. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Robert walked by twice, glancing at her light before attending to other passengers. The businessman beside Emma received his second scotch without even asking. The couple across the aisle had their pillows fluffed and blankets delivered. Yet Emma's call light remained unanswered. Finally, she pressed the button again. This time, Robert approached with visible annoyance etched across his face. Before Emma could speak, he let out an exaggerated sigh. "Economy passengers need to understand we're busy with priority customers," he announced, loud enough for several rows to hear. "The call button is for emergencies, not constant service requests." Few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An older woman 2 rows ahead turned around, her expression sympathetic. Emma remained composed, hands folded neatly in her lap. "I'd like some tea, please," she said quietly. "When you have a moment." Robert's lip curled slightly. "We'll get to it during the next beverage service. About 40 minutes from now." He turned away without waiting for a response. Emma made another note in her small black book. This wasn't just poor service. It was a textbook example of the subtle discrimination she planned to address in her new training program. She wrote down his exact words, knowing they would serve as a powerful teaching example. 20 minutes later, a different flight attendant appeared at Emma's side. Margaret Lewis was in her 50s, with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun. Unlike Robert, she wore her uniform with pride, each detail perfectly in place. "Ms. Thompson," Margaret said warmly, her voice dropping to a surprised whisper. "I didn't realize you were on board today. Is there anything you need?" Several nearby passengers looked up with interest. Emma smiled politely at Margaret, who had worked for Skyway Airlines for over 20 years. "Hello, Margaret. Some tea would be lovely if it's not too much trouble. Of course, right away. Milk and sugar?" "Just milk, thank you." Margaret disappeared toward the galley. Moments later, Robert emerged with her, carrying a tea service. His expression had transformed completely. Confusion mixed with dawning horror, as Margaret quietly explained who Emma was. "Your tea, Miss Thompson," he said, his voice now unnaturally high. "And some biscuits as well. Is there anything else I can get you?" "This is perfect, thank you," Emma replied, accepting the cup. She noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he poured. For the remainder of the flight, Robert became overly attentive, checking on Emma every 15 minutes. His sudden change in behavior only highlighted his previous discrimination. Several passengers noticed the difference, exchanging knowing glances. When the plane finally landed and taxied to the gate, Emma gathered her belongings unhurriedly. She watched as Robert stood by the exit door, bidding passengers farewell with a fixed smile. As other flight attendants wished travelers a pleasant day, Robert's eyes kept darting toward Emma's row. When she finally approached the exit, Robert stood frozen, his face ashen. He looked as though he might be sick right there in the cabin. Emma paused before him, aware of Margaret watching from nearby. Robert swallowed hard. "Ms. Thompson, Emma raised her hand gently, stopping his stammered apology. The other passengers had disembarked, leaving them momentarily alone in the narrow aisle. She could have dressed him down there, making an example of him. She could have threatened his job or demanded an apology. Instead, she spoke in a calm, measured tone. "I'd like to see you in my office tomorrow morning, Robert. 9 o'clock. Without waiting for his response, she walked past him and into the jetway. Behind her, she heard him exhale shakily. Margaret gave her a subtle nod of approval as she passed. Walking through the terminal, Emma reflected on what had transpired. True leadership wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about creating opportunities for growth and improvement. Tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be pleasant for Robert, but it would be necessary, not just for him, but for every passenger who'd ever felt invisible or unworthy of basic respect. Emma arrived at her office early the next morning. The spacious room reflected her organized approach to work. Neat stacks of papers, family photos arranged precisely on her desk, and a small potted plant by the window. She had slept poorly, turning over the incident from yesterday's flight in her mind. She pulled up the company's customer feedback database on her computer and typed in Robert Wilson. The results made her frown. Over the past 6 months, 15 separate complaints mentioned his name specifically. Most described selective treatment, attentive service for some passengers, dismissive behavior toward others. The pattern was clear and troubling. At precisely 9 o'clock, a soft knock sounded at her door. Emma straightened her blazer and called, "Come in." Robert entered, looking nothing like the confident flight attendant from yesterday. His uniform hung slightly wrinkled, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands clutched his hat nervously. He seemed to have aged overnight. "Please, take a seat," Emma said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Robert sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I suppose I'm being sacked then," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Emma studied him for a moment. "Actually, Robert, I want to understand why yesterday happened." He looked up, confusion replacing the dread on his face. "You're not firing me?" "I haven't decided anything yet," Emma replied honestly. "But first I'd like to hear your side of things." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "There's nothing to explain. I was rude to you, and you're the VP. I deserve whatever punishment comes." Emma tapped her finger on the stack of complaint reports. "This isn't just about yesterday. These are 15 customer complaints specifically mentioning your name in the last 6 months, all describing similar behavior." Robert's face flushed red. "They're exaggerating. Passengers always complain when they don't get special treatment." "Is that what you think I wanted? Special treatment?" Emma asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them. Robert's defensive posture gradually softened as the silence stretched. "My father's been ill," he finally said, his voice cracking. "Slightly. Terminal cancer. I've been his primary caretaker for 8 months now. The medical bills—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "I had to sell my flat, move in with him. I'm sleeping on his sofa, barely getting 4 hours of rest between caring for him and working flights." Emma listened without interrupting as Robert continued. "The financial strain has been enormous. I picked up extra shifts whenever possible, but it's never enough. The stress—" He ran a hand through his hair. "I know it's no excuse for how I've been treating passengers. I just feel angry all the time, and sometimes that spills over at work. But not with all passengers," Emma noted, gently. "The complaints show a pattern." Robert's eyes dropped again. "I suppose I'm harder on some than others. It's not intentional, at least I didn't think it was." Emma nodded. "It rarely is intentional, Robert. That's what makes unconscious bias so difficult to address." She stood up, walking to the window before turning back to face him. "When I was starting out at this airline 20 years ago, I was the only black woman in my department. My supervisor constantly criticized my work while praising my white colleagues for identical performance. When I finally gathered the courage to speak with his manager, I expected to be dismissed. Instead, she listened, then shared her own similar experiences." Robert looked up, truly seeing Emma for the first time. She could have reported him or had him transferred. Instead, she created a mentoring program that paired him with diverse colleagues. Years later, he thanked her for changing not just his career, but his perspective. Emma returned to her desk, picking up the stack of complaints. "Someone once gave me a chance to learn rather than punishing me. I'm offering you the same opportunity, Robert." His eyes widened in surprise. "After how I treated you. This isn't about forgiving bad behavior. It's about addressing the root causes and creating meaningful change," Emma explained. "I'm developing a new training program focused on unconscious bias and customer dignity. I want you to help me design it." Robert stared at her in disbelief. "You want my help? Why would you trust me with something like that?" "Because meaningful change begins with honest conversations and the courage to face uncomfortable truths," Emma replied. "And because sometimes the people who need to learn the most can become the strongest advocates once they understand." For the first time since entering her office, Robert straightened his shoulders. A hint of hope replaced the defeat in his eyes as he realized he was being offered not just forgiveness, but a path forward. The first meeting for the new training program took place in a small conference room at Skyway Airlines headquarters. Emma had arranged for coffee and pastries, hoping to create a welcoming atmosphere. Still, Robert arrived looking tense, fidgeting with his tie as he took a seat across from her. "I've outlined some initial concepts," Emma said, sliding a folder toward him. "But I want your honest input. You've been on the front lines for years." Robert opened the folder hesitantly. "I'm not sure what I can contribute," he admitted. "I'm the problem, not the solution." Emma shook her head. "Sometimes those who've made mistakes have the clearest vision of how to fix them." Over the next 3 hours, they discussed specific scenarios flight attendants face daily. Robert gradually relaxed, offering insights about the pressures of the job, the tight schedules demanding passengers, and exhaustion from long flights. But none of that excuses treating people differently based on how they look, he acknowledged, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. By the end of their first week working together, Robert had shifted from reluctant participant to engaged collaborator. He started arriving with notes and ideas, eager to share his thoughts on how training could address the subtle ways bias manifested. During flights, Emma named their initiative the Dignity in Flight program. Together, they created workshop modules exploring unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and the impact of small interactions on passenger experience. "We need real voices in this training," Emma said one afternoon. "People sharing actual experiences." Robert nodded slowly. "I know some crew members who might be willing to participate." Emma arranged for Robert to join flights with diverse crew members who agreed to mentor him. On these flights, he observed the different ways passengers responded to various attendants, and how subtle changes in service approach affected overall experience. After one particularly long international flight, Robert met with Emma, his notebook filled with observations. "James gets completely different treatment than Priya, even though they're both providing identical service," he explained. Passengers interrupted Priya constantly, questioned her authority about safety protocols, while they smiled and thanked James for the same instructions. "And how did that make you feel watching it happen?" Emma asked. Robert was quiet for a moment. "Ashamed," he finally said, "because I realized I've been part of that problem." 6 weeks into developing the program, Emma organized a feedback session with select passengers who had experienced both excellent and poor service. An elderly woman named Dorothy spoke about flying to visit her daughter. "At my age, you become invisible," Dorothy explained to the group. "Flight attendants look past you, speak louder as if you can't hear, or treat you like you're confused." She turned to Robert, who had served on her recent flight after beginning the training program. "But you, young man," she continued, "you looked me in the eyes, asked if I needed help with my bag without assuming I couldn't manage. Your smile and attention made me feel human again." Robert's eyes filled with tears. He blinked rapidly, trying to maintain his composure. The program gained momentum throughout the airline. However, not everyone supported Emma's initiative. During a quarterly review meeting, several executives questioned the cost. "We need to focus on profitability," argued Finance Director William Parker. "This training requires substantial resources. Perhaps we should scale it back. Or eliminate it entirely," added another executive. "Our competitors aren't investing in this sort of thing." Emma stood at the front of the boardroom, Robert beside her with their presentation materials. She could feel his tension as the criticisms mounted. "With all due respect," Emma said firmly, "this isn't about public relations or following industry trends. This is about who we are as a company." She clicked to a slide showing improved customer satisfaction scores from their pilot program. "Beyond the numbers, this is about human dignity. Every passenger deserves the same respectful service, regardless of how they look or where they're seated." Robert stepped forward, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "As someone who needed this training myself, I can tell you it changes not just how we serve passengers, but how we see ourselves as professionals." After the meeting, Robert and Emma walked silently down the hallway, waiting for the decision about their program's future. Sometimes the greatest challenges become our most powerful teachers when we approach them with an open heart. The Grand ballroom of London's Dorchester Hotel buzzed with excitement. 6 months had passed since Emma and Robert began their Dignity in Flight program, and today marked its official unveiling at Skyway Airlines' annual conference. Airline executives from across Europe filled the room, curious about the initiative. That had industry insiders talking. Emma stood backstage reviewing her notes one final time. Beside her, Robert adjusted his tie nervously. "What if they don't believe I've changed?" he whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. Emma smiled reassuringly. "They will. Just speak from your heart, like we practiced." When they walked onto the stage together, the audience fell silent. Emma approached the microphone first, her professional demeanor masking the butterflies in her stomach. "Good morning," she began. "6 months ago, I took an economy flight as a regular passenger. What happened that day could have ended with disciplinary action and nothing more. Instead, it sparked a transformation that has changed our entire company." She clicked through slides showing remarkable improvements in customer satisfaction scores. Complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped by 70%. Overall passenger experience ratings had increased across all demographics, with the most significant gains among elderly passengers, people of color, and those traveling in economy class. "These numbers tell only part of the story," Emma continued. "The real success lies in the cultural shift within our teams." She stepped aside, gesturing for Robert to take the microphone. He walked forward, hands slightly trembling. The room remained perfectly still as he cleared his throat. "My name is Robert Wilson," he began. "6 months ago, I was that flight attendant who judged passengers based on their appearance, their clothes, where they sat on the plane." His voice grew steadier as he continued. "I treated some people with warmth and others with dismissal, all without realizing the pattern of my behavior." Robert described the moment he discovered Emma's identity, the shame he felt, and his certainty that his career was over. "Ms. Thompson could have fired me. No one would have questioned that decision," he said. "Instead, she helped me become better, not just as an employee, but as a person." He explained how the training program had opened his eyes to his unconscious biases, the ways his personal struggles had affected his work, and how facing these uncomfortable truths had transformed his approach to service. When the presentation ended, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Airline representatives crowded around Emma afterward, eager to learn how they might implement similar programs. Within months, 3 other major carriers had adopted versions of Skyway's approach. Industry magazines featured profiles of Emma and Robert, highlighting their unusual partnership and the program's remarkable results. 1 year after their difficult flight together, Emma found herself at Heathrow Airport, rushing to catch a connection to New York. As she hurried through the terminal, a familiar scene caught her attention. Robert stood at a boarding gate, helping an elderly woman with weathered hands and simple clothing. The woman moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane. Robert carried her bags with one hand while gently supporting her elbow with the other, walking at her pace without a hint of impatience. Emma paused, watching as he helped the woman settle into her seat, ensuring her comfort with genuine care and attention. He tucked a blanket around her legs, then bent down to listen carefully as she spoke, nodding with warm interest at her words. Only after ensuring the woman had everything she needed did Robert look up and notice Emma observing from the jetway. Their eyes met across the cabin. A year ago, such a moment would have filled him with dread. Today, his face broke into a genuine smile of recognition and something deeper, gratitude. Emma smiled back, no words needed between them. She continued to her own flight, heart full. What had begun as a painful encounter had blossomed into profound change, affecting countless passengers and crew members. As her own plane lifted into the clouds, Emma reflected on how sometimes life's most difficult moments could lead to unexpected growth. The incident that might have ended with bitterness and lost jobs had instead created a ripple effect of compassion and understanding. Sometimes meeting painful experiences with empathy rather than condemnation created the space for true transformation, not just for individuals, but for entire communities.